Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video I'm going to be going over the Scars of Fraternal Strife trinket. This trinket drops off the jailer or from your dinar, and if you see some of the top parses, if you see some of your favorite streamers or your favorite content creators that might be using this trinket, maybe you want to learn more about it, maybe you want to use it yourself, maybe you don't care about any of that, but you just see it and you want to try it out. And so we're going to go over first just how it works. Secondly, in the video, I will give some tips and some insights that I've learned using this trinket. And then lastly, I will specifically get into Rep Paladin with the trinket at the very end of the video. So let's go ahead and first just talk about how it works. So to do that, we need to have an idea of what it does. So when you equip the trinket, or when you equip the trinket, or when you've pressed it the first time, let's say you die or whatever, and you're not unequipping and re-equipping, you'll have a haste buff. The haste buff, the stat will depend on what eye level your trinket is, and you'll have haste, but then there'll also be a negative. It's a kiss curse. So you'll have a plus 10% damage echo 3 seconds later. So damage that you take is going to be echoed on you, 10% of that. So you're just taking increased damage, essentially. So you want to avoid taking damage as much as possible. Just in general, when you're using this trinket, it's a Kiss Curse trinket. Using your second rune, which if you already have the first rune gone, you can use the second rune right on pull, right as you start a dungeon, whatever. You use your second rune, and it's versatility, plus your healing received is reduced. So you're taking more damage, and you're getting less healing, which is important as well. The third rune will be critical strike plus a minor bleed effect on you. I say minor bleed because it doesn't do very much damage, honestly. The bleed is pretty much doesn't matter. The first two runes matter the most. The fourth rune will give you mastery plus a slow that goes up to 10 stacks. Now, if you're a class like Paladin, you can freedom off the debuff, and then it'll stack back up when the freedom's over. For example, if you have a friend, a holy paladin in your group or your raid or whatever, you could have them freedom you when you get up to 10 stacks as well, before you want to press the fifth rune. So the fifth rune is your stats are greatly increased. It's a 30-second buff, so your 4 runes that are on you turn into a 30-second buff. The stats are increased from those. It's not just the base amount. And then you also explode at the end of the 30 seconds for a big amount of damage. For my heroic trinket, it's like 30,000 damage. So a mythic trinket, I imagine, is a little bit more. And so you explode for a giant amount of damage. It also hits multi-targets. I couldn't find for sure if it's target capped or not, or if it's soft capped, but it does explode and hit multiple targets. You can assume at least 5, because that's just how the game works. But I'm not sure after that, as far as definitively. It is very hard to time that to hit a big pack as well, unless someone's literally helping you do it. So that's just the very basics of how this works. So it's a Kiss Curse, like I said, and yeah, that's how it works. So when you start a pull, also here, there's a weak aura. You can probably see it next to my camera down here, and I will post that as well. That will help you keep track of what rune you are on. So if you see, I don't know if you can see the 1 next to it or not, but right now it says 1 next to the rune, and it also tells me what the buff is and what the negative effect is underneath it. It's a bit of a bulky one, but yeah, it basically is, for the most part, all I need to know is what rune I'm on, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then that way I know I don't have to keep looking up at my buffs, and I know when to pop my 5th one. Popping your 5th one's kind of the hardest thing for this trinket. We'll kind of get into some tips and tricks now, because that's the basics of how it works. One more thing I guess that's important is it kind of works like Ashvane's Razor Coral, in that when you're stacking up the runes, it does not count as your trinket. So if I use my stun grenade here, you're going to see I have a 20-second cooldown before I can use my scars. Now if I just use my scars instead, that 20-second cooldown will not incur on my stun grenade. So it does allow you, especially early on, to use 2 on-use trinkets pretty seamlessly without it being too big of an issue. So it works a lot like Ashvane's Razor Coral, with the exception being that final 5th rune that gives you that 30-second buff. That does work like a normal trinket. So that will incur the 20-second cooldown on another on-use trinket. So stacking the runes is fine. You can do that whenever. You can just do that on cooldown. But The fifth one, you need to make sure it's, if you're using 2 unused trinkets like I currently am, you want to make sure that those are not like interfering with each other, or you're using them in the correct order that you want to use them in, and stuff like that. It's a very important part of this trinket that makes it a bit annoying. Obviously, if you're using it with a passive second trinket, then it doesn't become an issue whatsoever. You can just send it whenever you want, and you don't have to worry about it. That would be kind of the downside of the trinket. Obviously, it's a kiss curse, so there's downsides with that, taking extra damage and stuff like that. But I would say the real downside to the trinket is if you are using 2 unused. In fact, as we get into the tips and tricks here, I think once I get a mythic sigil, I will probably switch to sigil from my stun grenade, just so that way, especially in raid encounters, not necessarily dungeon encounters. In raid encounters, I'll probably switch to sigil just so I don't have to worry about that, and I can just send scars with my wings every time, my 2-minute cooldown every time, and not have to worry about it overlapping correctly with the stun grenade and stuff like that. It's just going to be a lot easier to deal with. And so yeah, when it comes to scars in raid, the number one thing that I've noticed is for a patchwork fight, this trinket is just insanely good. You know, we just did Sanctum, so Eye of the Jailer, Guardian, those are 2 that come right to my mind. Obviously in other raids you have like Sludge Fist, stuff like that. These fights, it's extremely good for, where you're just constantly on one target. There's not a ton of running out and stuff like that. You constantly have uptime. It's extremely easy to use at that point. You could just keep sending it, keep sending it, keep sending it. On a fight like Sylvanas, not only are you taking a lot of damage in that fight, so your damage is echoed and your healing received is reduced, which can be a bad thing, which, you know, not the best thing in the world. But it's also hard because she disappears a lot. She goes, you know, kind of immune to damage when she gets to certain thresholds, and it's hard to time out your 5th rune perfectly on a fight like that unless your group is extremely consistent, so you know at this point I'm always going to press it and stuff like that. It can be a little bit hard to time that out a little bit, so that would be like a negative for the trinket, is on a fight like that. So if you were ever not going to use it, it'd be on a fight where you can't necessarily time things out. Now in dungeons, it's just insanely good in my opinion. Yes, again, if you're there might be certain dungeons you don't want to use it for because of the extra damage and stuff like that you're going to be taking, but you can pretty much just send this, play with 4 runes, and then launch the 5th rune on a big trash pull or whatever, or into a boss, you know, for the single target damage, whichever way it may work. And, you know, that can be extremely powerful as well. I had a lot of fun with it in Mythic Plus Dungeons so far, and I do pretty much recommend it all the time. And like I said, I mentioned about switching to sigil for raid encounters, where I would probably just keep my grenade up for Mythic Plus dungeons and just keep cycling them through. It's not as difficult, as because timings are not as you know, enforced or whatever, especially if you're just pugging keys. And then even if you aren't pugging keys, if you have a dedicated group, it can be fine, because you know, you can kind of play around your trinket, be like, okay, I have scars 5th rune up, let's do a big pull, you know, stuff like that. So it can be good in both ways, in a pug where you just send it constantly, and in a you know, dedicated group where they, you know, will play around your trinket cooldown and stuff like that, because it's very powerful. So in my opinion, most raid encounters it's really good. All raid encounters it's good, but most raid encounters it's really good. Dungeons, and it's also pretty good as well, so in pretty much all cases. So it's just a really solid trinket. You just have to get the timings down. You have to know your raid timings. It's extremely hard to hit the number one thing is you want to make sure the exploding damage is hitting something at the end of the trinket. At the end of the 30 seconds of the 5th rune, you want to make sure the exploding damage is hitting something. You don't want that just to hit nothing in the void, because that takes away a big part of the damage from the trinket, right? You wouldn't want that to miss. So it is a little bit hard. You have to make sure, if you're using it on a pull in a dungeon, that the pull is going to last at least 30 seconds. You need to make sure that on a boss fight, you know, like Sylvanas, she's not going to disappear while it blows up, and then or she's not immune to damage or whatever when it blows up. Or if you're using it in the second phase, when you're on platforms, that the ads don't die, just like a Mythic Plus pull, that the ads don't die and then it doesn't hit anything. Those are kind of the issues, and that's why more like patchwork fights, it's actually better, because for the most part you can stay on the boss. You just time it around so you're not like running away from the boss at the time, and you're close to the boss and can explode on him. So it's a lot easier on those fights. 100%. Another tip for this trinket. Now, if you watch the Great Push, which is the WoW esport where they push dungeons as high as they can go into the plus 30s, and it's actually kind of fun, I think, to watch. But if you watch that, you will have seen them playing Lower Karazhan with Maiden of Virtue. I believe that's her name. And she does Mass Repentance, and everyone, is kind of stuck. And the way you're supposed to break the mechanic is you take a damage from the Sacred Ground on the ground, but that ticks for a lot of damage. Now, what's really nice with Scars is you can actually use the bleed to your, help there. So during the Maiden fight, essentially, you would be at 3 or 4 runes for the entire fight. And then you'd only pop the 5th rune when it's a commit, right? When you're going to kill. So every Mass Repentance, you'd just break yourself out immediately with a very small bleed effect. The bleed does, like I said when I was going over the trinket, the bleed does very low amount of damage, breaks you right out of the Mass Repentance, and then you just keep doing damage. Like I said, you just keep the runes up, and then you send the 5th rune. When it's commit, time to kill the boss, we're not getting another Mass Repentance. That's when you commit and send it for the full damage there. So it's a very niche, but anything like that, anything where you could use damage to break you out of something, the bleed is very, very good for that. In particular, so it was kind of like a must-use trinket for melee on Maiden in the Great Push, and it's just very good. Now I happen to play a Paladin, so I have Blessing of Sacrifice, which kind of can do the same thing, where I just sacrifice somebody else who's, you can sacrifice somebody else who's using Scars, you can sacrifice somebody who's using whatever to break themselves out, the dot from the Sacred Ground, whatever. So that's, it's not super useful for me in particular, but in general, it's just such a low amount of damage that you might as well use it or whatever. So it's very, very good for that in particular. Other than that, like I said, just quick recap before we get into the ret stuff. Very, very good for single target, patchwork type stuff. It can be good for multi-target too, but when I say patchwork, I guess I mean more like patchwork, not in that it's single target, but patchwork in that there's not a ton of mechanics going on where you have to run away from the boss and stuff like that. Fights with a lot of uptime, Scars is just insanely good for. And if you have it, you probably want to use it for every single one of those fights. Fights where you're running around a lot, where timings are weird, boss goes immune, all that kind of weird stuff. Maybe you push Sire at a weird time. I'm thinking of other bosses. You push Sire at a weird time, and you have to do the phase 1 where you run to the center, and then your trinket goes off then, because you mistimed it by 3 seconds or something, right? That would be terrible. So you do have to really measure your timings really well with this. It does take some amount of skill to use on bosses like that in raids, but if you're up for it, it's definitely fun to use. It's definitely fun to try to plot out when to use it and to get the most value out of it and everything like that. And it's very fun to play around with. So I highly recommend the trinket. Ret Paladin's extremely squishy. I didn't feel, especially in the dungeons, I didn't feel like I was taking too much damage or anything from the negative effects. The slow, as a Paladin, I can freedom off, so I didn't really feel the curse that much for it. A little bit on Sylvanas, if I'm being completely honest, on Mythic Sylvanas, but other than that, I didn't feel too much curse, and I felt more of the positive effect. I performed very well in the first raid using it, and yeah, I definitely recommend it for sure. Let's go ahead and finally go into the Ret Paladin specific stuff on this. And I actually have a little bit of a thing here on how you might use it. Now, if you're not Ret, this still could help you if you're still with me here. So at the beginning of the fight, you're always going to start with 1 rune. Whether you equipped it or whether you use it before the fight, you want to start with your first rune at least. You typically want to have the cooldown up when you pull the boss as well. So you want to use it at least 30 seconds before the pull time or whatever, right? So this would be like a raid boss encounter, right? This is just an example. It doesn't mean you have to do it this way, but this is an example of how you can do it. So on pull, you can use your second rune. Like I said, this does not incur your other trinket's 20-second cooldown yet. Only the 5th rune does that. So then you use your other trinket. So in my case, right now, that would be Stun Grenade plus my wings, 2-minute cooldown. And then at 30 seconds in, I'm going to use my 3rd rune, At 1 minute in, I'm going to use my 4th rune. At 140 instead of 130, I'm going to use my 5th rune. And then, so why is that? Because it lasts 30 seconds, 20 seconds until my wings are up, and then 10 seconds of wings plus 10 seconds of wings plus 5th rune plus other trinket. So that's why I would do it this way. At 140 5th rune, 10 seconds of damage will be in the 2-minute CD plus the explosion. At 2 minutes, use 2nd trinket with the 2-minute cooldown. At 210, use your 1st rune. At 240, 2nd rune. 310, 3rd rune. 340, 4th rune. And then at 4 minutes, use your 2nd trinket with 2-minute cooldown, or run sigil, I put. And then at 420, you use your 5th rune into the very, very end of your wings, the last 5 seconds if you're running Sanctified Wrath. At 420, use your 5th rune into the end of your 2-minute cooldown. Or if you're using sigil, at 410, you just use your 5th rune with your 2-minute cooldown. So you just hold your wings for 10 seconds in that example where you would use your sigil on the pole. And this is why specifically I said that especially for raid encounters, I'm probably going to switch to sigil once I have a mythic sigil, because Enforcer Storm Grenade at 304 is just better than my heroic sigil. So I either need to get mythic sigil drop or an upgrade token to a first sigil, and then you can use that on pole, and then you can just scars the rest of the fight. And then, if the fight lasts 5+ minutes, then you can get another sigil use in. But if not, it's actually just going to be a little bit easier. Although, I just laid it out for, I guess it's not that hard to use the grenade with it as well. But yeah, it's just a little bit easier, I guess, for sigil usage, because you're not constantly using your trinkets every 2 minutes or whatever. Other tips for Ret Paladin. Don't be afraid to immune, to use your bubble, right? So you have 4 runes on you. The pole's getting really, really spicy, whether it's a dungeon or whatever. You can just go ahead and use your bubble. It does not remove the runes. It does remove the negative effects while your bubble's up. So you don't have to deal with the negatives of it, obviously. You're not taking damage, so you don't take excess damage. You shouldn't need healed that much while you're in your bubble, so the healing reduce isn't a huge deal. You're not slowed when you're in bubble, and then you're also not bleeding when you're in bubble. So you can go ahead and use that. You can clear the slow effect with Blessing of Freedom. So you can go ahead and use your Blessing of Freedom. That'll clear your slow effect on you, and that'll remove the debuff. Now, as soon as Freedom is over and you use an ability, you will start stacking up the debuff again. So it's not like it's removed permanently. So you want to kind of save your freedom for when you're running out of something, when you're running out of a mechanic, or whatever, you have to do a soak or something like that. You want to have your freedom up, so that way you have 100% mobility essentially, and so it doesn't really affect you at all as a paladin, and it's kind of easy to play around in that way. In fact, it's just very good for Ret in general, in that you can play around it quite easily. So I have the bleed on right now, and you can see it's not actually a debuff. The rune itself is doing damage, so unfortunately you can't clear the bleed off of yourself, but it does almost no damage. I just wanted to get that activated, and it'll slowly tick you down even out of combat, but it's very, very, very low damage to where you don't really have to worry about it, and it doesn't continue to go up. And of course, you're going to send your 5th rune as soon as you can. Obviously, you have to do your 4th rune first, but then you'll want to send your 5th rune as soon as you can, as soon as you have a 30-second window or whatever, and then you won't have to worry about the bleed anymore. So the bleed will last, about a minute or so or more, but it's not a huge deal. Is there anything else for Ret Paladin specifically with this trinket? Just, we are squishy, so some classes might be able to use the trinket a little bit more effectively than us. I will say, I did mention during Sylvanas Mythic, it was quite a bit of damage that I was taking from the especially from the arrows or whatever in the last phase. Those were hitting me quite hard and then echoing the damage. So that, and then the healing reduced, so that was a little bit rough. We are, like I said, a little bit squishy. So if you are using it on a fight like that, it could be a good time to bubble, like on that if you get to the last little platform on Sylvanas final phase. It could be a good time to just use your bubble during some of those arrows there. If anything is going sketchy at all, just go ahead and use it, because it can be a lot of damage, and we don't have a ton of defensive ability to negate that damage. So that's where having like a divine protection would be very helpful with a trinket like this. So it is something you do have to keep in mind for sure, it being just kind of a squishy class. So yeah, overall, I highly recommend the trinket though. It's really fun. I'm going to upgrade it to Mythic as soon as I get a couple more tokens here. Upgrade this trinket to Mythic and just probably use it the rest of the expansion. And every content that I do, I probably will be switching to Sigil for raids and keeping my Enforcer Stun Grenade for Mythic Plus dungeons. And that's just what I'm going to do personally. If you have any other like Ret Paladin tips or any other thoughts on scars that I didn't go over here, feel free to comment them below. And yeah, that's it for this one, guys. As always, I do ask you to please subscribe to the channel. It helps me out so much. And other than that, everybody, have a good one.